Hello, it's Amy. I'm here with a read aloud, and today I've got Too Much College by Stephen Leacock, and we're going to read just the first chapter here, which is titled Education Eating Up Life. And we do have a short description at the beginning of the chapter outlining exactly what he's going to cover here. Education longer and longer, life 10 years too late and death on time, where we got our curriculum, medieval schools with modern extension, a scholar and a gentleman, plus a scientist and a businessman, and the straws on the camel's back. So if that sounds interesting to you, be sure to stick around. If it doesn't, then go on your way and perhaps come back for a different video. And I should mention that this is a Canadian author from the 20th century. We are looking at a 1939 initial publication date for this work. In this discussion of education, I am addressing myself to plain people. By this, I mean people who shudder at mathematics, go no farther in Latin than e pluribus unum, and take electricity as they find it, as opposed to those are the academic class who live in colleges or in the shadow of them and claim education as their province. But the plain people are of necessity interested in education because their sons and daughters go to college, or more important, can't go to college. Now the plain people have noticed that education is getting longer and longer. 50 years ago, people learned to read out of a spelling book at 6 years old, went to high school at 12, and taught school for money on a third-class certificate at 16. After that, 2 years in a sawmill and 2 at a medical school made them doctors, or 1 year in a sawmill and 1 in divinity fitted them for the church. For law, they needed no college at all, just 3 summers on a farm and 3 winters in an office. All our great men in North America got this education. Pragmatically, it worked. They began their real life still young. With the money they didn't spend, they bought a wife, but by the age of 30, they had gotten somewhere or nowhere. It is true that for 5 years of married life, they carried, instead of a higher degree, bills for groceries, coal, doctors, and babies' medicine. When they broke out of the woods into the sunlight, established men at an age when their successors are still demonstrating, interning, or writing an advanced thesis on social impetus. Now it has all changed. Children in school at 6 years old cut up paper dolls and make patterns. They are still in high school till 18, learning civics and social statistics, studies for old men. They enter college at about 19 or 20, take prerequisites and postrequisites in various faculties for nearly 10 years, then become demonstrators, invigilators, researchers, or cling to a graduate scholarship like a man on a raft. At 30, they are just beginning 10 years too late. They can't marry till 10 years too late. They have children 10 years too late and die 10 years too early. They know nothing of the early life of the man who worked in sawmills, practiced medicine at 20 and married 6 months later, with no other property than a stethoscope and a horse and buggy, or of the young lawyer who married in debt and lived happily in it ever after. Safety first has put its stamp on life. Population begins to die at the top, and all the time education grows longer and longer. This does not deny that the average human life is now longer. It means that paternity is shorter. People do not see enough of their grandchildren, the sweetest prospect in the world. Life has all too little evening. It has all run in arrears and never catches up. All this, you will say, is exaggerated, is overcolored, is not truth. Very likely. But a half-truth in argument, like a half-brick, carries better. High colors show up where neutral tints blend to nothing. Yet the main truth gets over. Education is eating up life. In the above paragraphs, I have formulated the plain man's accusations against the continued lengthening of education, or rather, I must not say his accusation. The poor fellow hasn't the spirit to accuse. It is not an accusation that he formulates or a grievance that he voices. It is just a burden that he carries. He carries it because of the prestige of education. Round the idea of education is effort and opportunity. There have clustered centuries of tradition and association. These are stamped in such words and phrases as the little red schoolhouse, the midnight oil, the eager student, the kindly dominion, the absent-minded professor. With this has grown up the notion, no doubt partly true, that the harder the path of learning, the higher the achievement. There is no royal road to learning. Still cheers those who are unaware that the public road itself has become overgrown with a jungle of underbrush. In other words, people don't complain. On the contrary, they are often proud of the burden they carry. Parents have no regrets for the 15 years of sacrifice they made to give their children the education they should have had in half the time. It is a tradition with us that education opens opportunity. To send a boy to college is an ambition that wakes to life beside a cradle. "How is your son doing at school, Mr. McGregor?" I once asked of a Scotsman of the traditional type. "Fine," he answered. "If he keeps on as he is, we'll have to put the college to him." Even in the clutter and failure of youth's career among the blocked avenues of our misfit world, the college comes into its own as a sort of refuge. "My son," said another parent, "doesn't seem to have any particular ability, so we think we'll have to send him to college. He seems no good for anything else." The one anxiety of such parents is, can he get in? Beyond that, no need to look. It's like being dipped in the Jordan. But even if the plain man were to raise his complaint against the lengthening road and the increasing burden, he would be laughed out of court by the academic class. He would be told that our education is all too short. The teachers in the high schools would say that the children come to them hopelessly unprepared and ought to stay a year longer in public school. Every professor will tell them that the first-year students at college are simply hopeless and ought to have stayed at least a year, or call it 2, at high school. The students in the second year ought never to have left the first. The third-year men haven't the proper grounding for their work, and the fourth year are so rotten that they have to be given degrees to get rid of them. As for the graduate school, the students in it should never have been admitted. They are not yet fit for advanced work. Their minds are immature. And even when they do get out of graduate school, by sheer lapse of time, it seems ridiculous to think of them as fit to teach or do anything. Oh no, they have to go to Germany for a year anyway, to somewhere for a year and come back with whiskers and look like something. I once put the question of shortening the college curriculum to my old friend Dean Elderberry Foible, Dean of the Faculty of Arts. "You didn't know him, but there was a dean at your college just like him." "Preposterous," he said, "preposterous." And that settled it. If we turn from the general view to the particular subjects, the case against any attempt to shorten the curriculum becomes simply overwhelming. So much so that we are crushed and humbled in presenting it. Imagine trying to leave out mathematics, the queen of sciences, or history, the very basis for understanding our modern life, or English literature, our legacy common to England and America, dear as the very hearthstones of our home. Who dares touch that? Or who will dare disturb Latin, the bedrock of our culture, or foreign languages, the amenity of polite life, or geology, deep as the caverns of thought, biology, life's interpretation, or the social sciences, the key to the padlock of happiness still closed? Help! Nothing but pretentious ignorance could suggest leaving out anything. As to any shortening, ask again my friend Dean Elderberry Foible, and he will tell you that you can't. My dear sir, you may wish to, but you simply can't, with that academic finality with which professors dismiss the ideas of students. So it appears even to ourselves on a first survey. Take mathematics. How can you shorten the subject? That stern struggle with the multiplication table, for many people not yet ended in victory. How can you make it less? Square root, as obdurate as the hardwood stump in a pasture. Nothing but years of effort can extract it. You can't hurry the process. Or pass from arithmetic to algebra. You can't shoulder your way past quadratic equations or ripple through the binomial theorem. Indeed, the other way, your feet are impeded in the tangled growth. Your pace slackens. You sink and fall somewhere near the binomial theorem, with the calculus in sight on the horizon. So died for each of us, still bravely fighting our mathematical training, except only for a set of people called mathematicians, born so like crooks. Yet, would we leave mathematics out? No, we hold our cross. Latin too. Do you want your son to grow up not knowing what a sine qua non is? And who wrote Virgil's Aeneid? Then he not only needs the whole present curriculum, but more. At present, the student learns just enough Latin not to be able to read it. He stops short of the saturation point, just gets wet with it, and no more. But why recite the entire list? The same truth holds for the academic profession, or of every one of the subjects of the school and college course. The student is not saturated when he ought really to be soaked. A parallel resistance blocks the pathway leading to the professions. The idea of any immediate entry into them for a young man just out of college is ridiculous. 100 years ago, a man just out of college looked as good as a coin fresh from the mint, a sickle from the whetstone. At 27, he was a member of Congress. Had 4 or 5 children, owned $3,000 or $4,000 worth of property in his own right, and owed $5,000. But nowadays, imagine trusting a serious case of illness to a young fellow of 27 barely out of college, until yesterday an intern in a hospital. Out of the question. And later, when at last his turn comes, it is but a brief acme of success, and then all of a sudden it seems people are saying, he's too old for the job, losing his grip. In fact, he's nearly 50. He's an old doctor, once a term of esteem and confidence, but now equivalent to an old horse. Thus, in our ill-fit world, youth and age jostle and hurry one another together, too young and then too old. Those who follow gardening know that green peas are at first too young to pick, and then overnight, it seems, too old to eat. So with our educated people. Homer long ago said, "As is the race of leaves, so is the race of men." Make it college graduates and garden peas, it still holds good. How did all this come about? Our systems of education arose out of the medieval Latin schools of the Church. It still carries, like a fossil snake in a stone, the mark of its original structure. Not that this was the earliest kind of education, but the others were different. Greek education included music and dancing and what we call the arts. It was supposed to fit people to live. Medieval education was supposed to fit people to die. Any schoolboy of today can still feel the effect of it. Greek education was free from the problems that have beset our own. It didn't include the teaching of languages, the Greeks despising all foreigners as barbarians. It avoided everything practical, like the plague, and would have regarded a professor of engineering as a child of the devil, misusing truth. Mathematics, crippled by the want of symbols, became a sort of dream, intense, difficult, and proudly without purpose. Greek education carried with it no exams and tests for entry to the professions. A Greek dentist didn't have to pass in Latin, he used a hammer. Thus, philosophy, the love of knowledge, came into its own in talk as endless as on the porch of Kentucky country store. Scholars would deny the truth of this summary and talk of Archimedes, the world's first engineer, and Hippocrates, its earliest physician. But the proof of what I say is that Archimedes found no followers and Hippocrates waited 500 years for Galen. Scholars always see exceptions where a plain man sees an even surface. But even a billiard ball, if you look close enough, is all covered with bumps. Our education, then, comes down to us from the schools of the Middle Ages. These were organized by the Church, and the first aim was piety, not competence. The goal was the reading of the Scriptures, and by that the salvation of the soul. On this basis, Alfred the Great planned schools for Saxon England. So too in France did Charlemagne, who couldn't read or write, and felt a religious admiration for those who could, the same as an oil magnate of today feels towards a university. So presently the monastic schools arose, and from their oriel windows came forth among the elms trees the sound of Latin chants intoned by choristers, and in the silent scriptorium the light from a stained window fell on the quiet copyist, rewriting letter by letter in pigment upon parchment. In the beginning was the Word. Thus passed monastic life in its quiet transition to eternity. These were the earliest schools, secluded, scholarly, born ancient like the old-fashioned children of aging parents. For the date, place them anywhere in the 400 years from Alfred and Charlemagne to the days of Oxford and Paris. These later schools, Oxford, Paris, and such, came when study no longer taught people how to die and keep out of hell, but how to live as lawyers, two ambitions with an obvious relationship. Law hatched out under the wings of the Church as a duck hatches under a hen, later to horrify its parents. Here again the vertebrae structure is still seen in the rock. Lincoln's Inn and Gray's Inn were originally, in a sense, works of God, the defunct Doctors' Commons till its end a spirituality. Law, in England at least, struggled long before it shook off the hand of ghostly guidance. Even now the connection between law and religion remains in the quantity of oaths by which the business of the law secures its righteousness. So there came, then, such schools as Oxford and Paris, what seemed to have been at first huge random gatherings of students. Medieval exaggeration puts 30,000 at Oxford in pre-record days. They had, before printing, hardly any books and no examinations. The curriculum ran to endless discussions, more Kentucky. These disputations begot tests and awards, degrees, and brought into the world that child of sin, the written examination. A few odd people, like Roger Bacon, began digging into black knowledge about gunpowder and so forth, and got put into jail for it. The lamp of learning still fell only on the kingdom of light, with lawyers dancing in the shadows. The curriculum of these schools, the bedrock on which ours still rest, was the famous Trinity of study, the trivium, which meant grammar, rhetoric, and logic. To this was supplemented the 4 farther studies, called the quadrium: music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. All were based on the use of Latin. They comprehended the whole circuit of human knowledge, and the supreme purpose of it all was salvation. The monk, Elkian, who was Charlemagne's specialist in education, has described for us how he taught his students. To some I administer the honey of the sacred writings. Others I try to inebriate with the wine of the ancient classics. I begin the nourishment of some with the apples of grammatical subtlety. I strive to illuminate many by the arrangement of the stars, as from the painted roof of a lofty palace. The whole extent of human knowledge was still within human comprehension. In our own day we meet men who think they know it all. In the Middle Ages there were men who were sure they did. Of course, where knowledge ended, superstition began, and that was infinite. It was this curriculum which in the course of centuries has been expanded beyond recognition, like the toad in Aesop that would be an ox. And still it has not burst. It drags along its huge amorphous outline, flabby as a dinosaur, over 15 years of life. Here is what happened to expand it. The revival of learning resuscitated Greek, a study forgotten by all but the Arabs. The rising kingdoms that replaced feudalism brought national states and set people to learning one another's languages. The English, having forgotten French, had to learn it again. Italian became polite. Milton suggested that one ought to learn it in an odd hour. Modern languages were still not a part of education, but a sort of annex. So they remained till yesterday in England, where all Englishmen were supposed to know French from a governess and a copy of Ollendorff's grammar, and a trip to Boulogne. But till yesterday, Eton, Rugby, and Oxford never heard of it. Printing once in real use expanded both opportunities and obligation. Students henceforth had books. Contacts with the Arabs revealed a system of decimal notation that made arithmetic a reality and algebra a power. Mathematics in the time of the Stuarts with logarithms and calculus ceased to be a dream. Physics converted Elkin's wonder of the sky into classroom formula. But even though mathematics in the 1600s, in the days of Newton and Descartes, had become a real and intensive study, far transcending in reach and in difficulty anything within the range of the ordinary college man of today, it was still regarded rather as an annex to learning than as learning itself. The place of priority still lay with classical study, with the literature of Greece and of Rome. In this, America was a faithful child of England. Our earliest college education was stamped with Roman letters, and its passion for the Bible and the wilderness made it even revert somewhat to the medieval type. The rules that were promulgated in 1642 for admission to Harvard College laid down the qualifications thus: when any scholar is able to understand Tully or such like classical Latin author extempore, and to make and speak true Latin in verse and prose, sua ut anet matra, and to decline perfectly the paradigms of nouns and verbs in the Greek tongue, let him then, and not before, be capable of admission into the college. For readers whose Latiny has slipped away from them, let it be explained that Tully is not Irish, but means Cicero. Earlier generations properly called Romans by their names, and not, as we have come to do, with many of them by their nicknames. Tully was called Cicero, or Beanhead, as one of us might be called Shorty. Harvard Latin in 1642 was still undefiled. On the terms indicated, few of us now would get into Harvard. Fewer still would get out, since for that every scholar had to be found able to read the originals of the Old and New Testaments into the Latin tongue, and to resolve them logically, withal being of godly life and conversation. On the outside edge or fringe of the classical studies, of which mathematics and logic formed an adjunct, were such things as natural philosophy, destined to vast and rapid expansion, but of which the classical doctors of divinity remained ignorant. By the time of Queen Anne, some scholars already admitted that they didn't know everything. Not many, though, or at least they qualified it by saying that what they didn't know wasn't worth knowing. But what they referred to by this last phrase was this natural philosophy, the new range of knowledge that the 18th century was gathering, item by item, fact by fact. These grew into sciences of life, botany and zoology, later to get their true name of biology. Reverend classical scholars, full to the throat with declensions, set them aside as a disturbance of the book of Genesis. But they wouldn't down. Beside them grew, equally despised by the classicists, the electric science drawn by Franklin from the clouds, the oxygen distilled by Priestley from water, the geology of Lyell, dug up from what was once called Hades. All the world knows the story. Within another 100 years, a vast series of studies known as the natural sciences, at first opposed, derided, and left to mechanics and steam engine drivers, broke at last the barriers of the school and flooded wide over the curriculum. But the barriers, in England at least, did not break until the waters had risen high and the pressure had become overwhelming. In the middle 19th century, as Professor Huxley complained in the so-called public schools still had a curriculum of the Middle Ages. Until a few years back, he wrote in 1893, a boy might have passed through any one of the great public schools with the greatest distinction and credit, and might never so much as heard of modern geography, modern history, and modern literature, of the English language as a language, or of the whole circle of the sciences, physical, moral, and social, might never have heard that the earth goes round the sun, that England underwent a great revolution in 1688, and France another in 1789, that there once lived a certain notable men called Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Voltaire, Goethe, and Schiller. With this protest of common sense went a certain protest of spite, as almost aristocratic culture by those unable to share it. Witness Herbert Spencer's diatribe against the education of a gentleman. Men dress their children's minds as they do their bodies in the prevailing fashion. As the Arinco Indian puts on his paint before he leaves his hut, so a boy's drilling in Latin and Greek is insisted on, not because of their intrinsic value, but that he may not be disgraced by being found ignorant of them, that he may have the education of a gentleman. When at last the barriers broke, the new science came in a flood, till every high school student in America, more even than in England, turned alchemist, and every classroom sputtered with electricity. And with this, in the college firsts, and spreading downwards to the schools, came a still newer set of studies, the social studies, economics and politics, the mingled brood of happiness and despair, of progress and poverty, that Mill and Spencer and such people let loose upon the world. So deeply have they spread that little children learn civics first and find out what it means after, and so widely that the Japanese have studied it from Europe and teach it to the Chinese. And as if civics and social welfare were not enough for the already overburdened curriculum, a chariot creaking up the rough slope of Parnassus, business, in the form of schools of commerce, must needs leap on top of the load. It handed so heavy a tip to the driver that it could not be put off, and more than that, it began to demand that the oldest and most respectable of the passengers be thrown out to make room for it. There we stand, or rather move slowly onward, the ascent of Parnassus turned into a 10 years' journey, during which the passengers must amuse themselves as best they may with the cards and dice of college activities. Meantime, it is only to be expected that the conditions of the journey react upon the minds of the passengers. In other words, it is only natural that this vast burden of an increasing curriculum sets up a reaction in the minds of the pupil and the student. From their earliest years, they become accustomed to reckon up the things that they have done and finished with. "We finished Scripture," says a little girl in a child's school. "We had it last year." For her, the mold of religious thought is all set. Don't ask her the names of the 12 apostles. She's had them last year. She is not responsible for the apostles anymore. So does the high school student count up his years still needed for matriculation as eagerly as a mariner measures his distance to the shore. The college student opens his career by classing himself not according to the year in which he enters, but according to the year in which he hopes to get out. The class matriculating in 1940 calls out in their infant breath, "Rah, rah, 44. How strange it is, our little procession of life. The child says, "When I am a big boy." But what is that? The big boy says, "When I grow up." And then grown up, he says, "When I get married." But to be married, what is that after all? The thought changes to "when I'm able to retire." And then when retirement comes, he looks back over the landscape traversed. A cold wind seems to sweep over it. Somehow he has missed it all, and it is gone. Life, we learn too late, is in the living, in the tissue of every day and hour. So it should be with education. And so it is not. A false view discolors it all. For the vastly great part of it, the student's one aim is to be done with it. There comes a glad time in his life when he has finished mathematics, a happy day when he has done philosophy, an exhilarating hour when he realizes he has finished with compulsory English. Then at last his 4 years are out, his sentence expired, and he steps out of college a free man without a stain on his character and not much on his mind. Later on he looks back wistfully and realizes how different it might have been. It is the purpose of this book and the chapters that follow to discuss this discrepancy here discussed in that of general education and the liberal arts, which occupy about 20 years of the life of the great majority of college students. The work of technical and professional schools, engineering, medicine, law, lies apart. Here, the adaptation of the means to the end is sufficiently direct to lessen the danger of wandering into the wilderness, as liberal arts has done. This wandering into the wilderness has made the journey of education too long, too cumbersome, and too expensive. Worse still, at the end of its wandering, it comes to a full stop. The road comes to an end, just where it ought to be getting somewhere. The passengers alight, shaken and weary, to begin all over again, something else. And that is the end of chapter 1. So I hope you enjoyed that. Education Eating Up Life.